Well, hello everyone. This is your friendly neighborhood pastor, Pastor Chris Johnson, coming to you from Christ the King Lutheran Church here in Escanaba, Michigan. We're getting ready for this weekend, which is the 11th Sunday after Pentecost. And what we're going to be doing for the next 5 weeks from now, from July 29th through August 26th, we're going to be focusing on the very densely worded and richly symbolic world of John chapter 6. So we'll be in John chapter 6 for 5 weeks. I wrote a little blog post, so to speak, for our website and for our weekly newsletter that talked about how I think John chapter 6 is a part of the many things that Jesus taught that he referred to back in Mark chapter 6, verse 34, something we heard last week. So here Jesus begins teaching. Actually doesn't do a whole lot of teaching here. That's more in the weeks ahead. But this week he feeds the 5,000 and walks on water. Last week, that was the text that was cut out from the pericope, from the lectionary reading, and we're getting John's version of the feeding of the 5,000. And that's one of the great things about this miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. It's one of the few miracles that's recorded in all of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Along with the resurrection. And so, without further ado, let me go ahead and read this text for you. It's a pretty big chunk this week, so we can't cover it all. We're looking at John 6, verses 1 through 21, then I'll give you some thoughts and reflections on it. St. John writes, "After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, 'Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?' He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?' Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told the disciples, 'Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost.' So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, 'This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world.' When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down across the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going." The Gospel of the Lord. To begin with, here again is Jesus in his Galilean ministry. In the context of John's Gospel, this is it's at least the second year of Jesus' wandering ministry. This is the second second time he's been doing things around the time of Passover. We'll hear that again, the time designation of Passover come up again in John, towards the end of John 11, John chapter 12. And so this is the second time Passover is mentioned in John's Gospel, hence why many scholars believe that this is a 3-year ministry of Jesus. With that being said, here we have Jesus again attracting a large audience, and we've been seeing this throughout all of the Gospels. Where Jesus goes, people are attracted to him. Maybe not so much by what he says, but certainly by what he does in regards to healing people, performing miracles, awesome displays of God's power, a foreshadowing of the kingdom to come, where all will be healed, where all will be fed, and there'll be more than enough for everybody. And we get a taste of that here in John 6 with the feeding of the 5,000. We have Philip, who is tested. We have Simon Peter's brother Andrew, not quite trusting in Jesus' power. And so you've got these disciples who've been with Jesus for at least a couple of years, and they still are doubting what he can do. They just saw someone who was an invalid be healed at the pool of Siloam. They saw Jesus heal someone else, an official son in John chapter 5. And so they saw Jesus upset the apple cart, so to speak, in John chapter 2 when he overthrew the temple, the money-changing tables in the temple. In John chapter 2, they saw Jesus turn water into wine. So miracles are not an uncommon thing. Certainly they're rare, but for the disciples, as they follow Jesus, they've seen these things before. But even then, they still are wondering, can Jesus, what is this, Jesus? What are you asking us to do? This is impossible. Not even 6 months' wages could feed all of these people. But there's a kid over here. He's got something. Maybe we can work with this. But even there's some doubt. What is this little Lunchable for all these people? But nevertheless, Jesus steps up to the occasion, feeds the people. The people, I think, misinterpret what this means, or rather, as is typical in John's Gospel, they interpret it in a very human way, that here is someone who can provide food, who can provide welfare, who can give us all the food stamps we need, so to speak, so let's make him king. He feeds our bellies. What else do we want in a king? Who cares what else he says, but he can feed us. And so in the context of the ancient Roman world, this was a very much a way to lead the people. You could tell the people whatever they wanted is as long as you fed them and entertained them. Circuses and bread. One of those themes that you see come up in the trilogy, for example, of the Hunger Games. If you entertain the people and feed them, then they'll look the other way at what you're doing in oppressing other people. And so here is Jesus. They want to make him king. Jesus withdraws because he's not going to be that kind of king. And this is a foreshadowing to the end of John chapter 6, because what Jesus says is going to really turn people away. So if you want a way to decrease membership in the church, so to speak, we look at John 6 and see what Jesus had to do, because he knew that the people were following him for not all the right reasons. They wanted Jesus because he was a wonder worker that could feed them, that could give them what they wanted. But they didn't want him as Lord, as Savior, who gives his life, his flesh, his blood for the life of the world. So there's the miracle of the feeding the people. Jesus is going to unpack that later on in John's Gospel, in John chapter 6, and that's going to be taking up most of our time for the next 4 weeks after this. And then we also get the second miracle of Jesus walking on water, and we see that the disciples are way out into the Sea of Galilee, this also called the Sea of Tiberias. At its longest point from north to south, the Sea of Galilee is about 8 miles, I believe. And so if they're going south from Capernaum, which it seems like they are, they're halfway into the lake. And so that's one of the great things about John's Gospel, being very specific in recording how far out these disciples are. And so John's Gospel has a number of other measurements and things of a very specific nature in his Gospel. We heard earlier how there's so much grass on the field. Why is John recording these seemingly unimportant things? But that certainly just lends to more about how the Bible is historically reliable, that we can trust it because these are eyewitness accounts. That being said, we see Jesus, and he's walking on water. We don't hear about Peter walking on water. That's in the other Gospels. But here, Jesus walks on water, and he doesn't rebuke the disciples for their lack of faith, like when Jesus calms the storm. We heard about that in Mark's Gospel a few weeks ago. But Jesus instead brings them comfort and says, it's me. It is I. Ego eimi, the divine name that we hear way back, for example, in Exodus chapter 3. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. Jesus says, I am, the same words that the Lord speaks to Moses out of the burning bush. It is I, don't be afraid. And so it is with that we leave you for this week as we confidently follow Jesus, not only by what he can provide us tangibly, but what he provides us spiritually, life for our souls. And because of that, because of who Jesus is, what he's come to do, therefore we have no need to be afraid, come what may. Darkness, storms, lack of food, lack of prosperity, we have Jesus, and Jesus will always be enough. Next week we turn turn to the last half of the chapter, looking at Jesus talking about himself being the bread of heaven. May God bless you and guide you as you dig into this rich chapter, and we'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye.